She spent her days surrounded by whispered conversations and the gentle rustle of turning pages, a woman whose voice never rose above library-appropriate levels, and whose idea of excitement was discovering a rare first edition tucked away in a donation box. Emma Rodriguez looked like every small-town librarian you'd ever imagine, with reading glasses perched on her nose, cardigans that had seen better decades, and hands that were more accustomed to handling delicate book spines than anything requiring strength or precision. At 34, she moved through Cedar Falls with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred backgrounds to spotlights, organizing community events with meticulous care while remaining virtually invisible herself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when that desperate man appeared at the Autumn Harvest Festival with wild desperation in his eyes, when innocent families scattered in terror and local law enforcement found themselves facing an impossible situation that required a miracle shot across an unprecedented distance, this quiet librarian would reveal that she held the world record for the longest confirmed precision shot in history at 4,200 meters, and the reason the town council had forbidden her from touching weapons had nothing to do with incompetence and everything to do with a military classification so high that most people didn't even know it existed. The morning sun painted Cedar Falls in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across Main Street as the mountain town stirred to life with the unhurried rhythm of a place where time moved at nature's pace rather than society's demands. The Riverside Community Center sat nestled between Miller's Coffee Shop and Peterson's hardware store, its brick facade weathered by decades of Montana winters, but sturdy enough to serve as the heart of community gatherings for generations of families who'd chosen this remote valley as their forever home. Emma Rodriguez stood in the center's main hall, clipboard in hand, surveying the controlled chaos of volunteers setting up for the annual Autumn Harvest Festival, with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned that success lay in the details most people overlooked. Tables draped in autumn-colored cloths lined the walls, soon to be filled with homemade preserves, hand-knitted scarves, and the kind of crafts that reflected the patient artistry of people who still believed in making things with their own hands. The air carried the mingled scents of apple cider, simmering in slow cookers, and fresh bread from the bake sale booth, creating an atmosphere of warmth and community that had drawn Emma to Cedar Falls 7 years ago, when she'd been looking for somewhere to disappear. At 5 feet 6 inches with dark hair, she kept pulled back in a practical bun and brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. While revealing nothing, Emma possessed the kind of understated presence that made people comfortable sharing their stories while rarely asking about hers. Her wardrobe consisted almost entirely of neutral colors and practical fabrics, clothes chosen for their ability to blend rather than stand out, and she moved with the measured grace of someone who'd learned to occupy space without drawing attention to the fact that she was occupying it. "Emma, where do you want the apple bobbing station?" called Jake Mitchell, a 19-year-old college sophomore who'd volunteered to help set up in exchange for community service hours his criminology program required. Jake possessed the kind of earnest enthusiasm that reminded Emma of herself at that age, back when she'd believed the world was a place where good intentions and hard work could solve most problems. His sandy hair stuck up at odd angles despite obvious attempts to tame it, and his flannel shirt bore the wrinkled evidence of someone still learning the finer points of laundry management. "By the east windows," Emma replied, her voice carrying the soft authority of someone accustomed to organizing without commanding. "The afternoon light will be better there, and it's close enough to the kitchen for easy water changes." She made a note on her clipboard, one of dozens of small decisions that would collectively determine whether 300 families had a memorable afternoon or a frustrating one. Emma had discovered that successful events, like successful disappearances, required attention to countless tiny variables that most people never considered. The festival represented months of planning, countless committee meetings held in the library's back room after hours, and the kind of community collaboration that only happened in places where neighbors still knew each other's names and histories. Emma had volunteered to coordinate the event because organization came naturally to her, because the library provided her with the perfect excuse to know everything happening in town without anyone questioning why she needed to know, and because staying busy kept her mind occupied with present concerns rather than past regrets. Mrs. Rodriguez, called Maria Chen, approaching with her 3-year-old daughter Lily balanced on her hip and exhaustion evident in every line of her face. Maria worked double shifts at the truck stop diner 20 miles down the highway, saving money for nursing school while raising Lily alone after her husband's deployment had ended differently than anyone had planned. I brought the face painting supplies, but I'm not sure I can stay to run the booth. Lily's been fussy all morning, and I think she might be coming down with something. Emma studied the little girl, noting the slightly glassy look in her dark eyes and the way she clung more tightly to her mother than usual. Why don't you take her home and get some rest? I can handle the face painting myself. The offer came without hesitation, though Emma had originally planned to spend the afternoon troubleshooting problems from her usual position near the information table, where she could monitor everything without becoming the center of attention. Are you sure? You're already doing so much, Maria said, but relief flooded her voice because single motherhood had taught her to accept help when it was genuinely offered, rather than martyring herself on the altar of false independence. Absolutely. Lily's health is more important than painted butterflies. Emma reached out to gently touch the little girl's forehead, her fingers automatically checking for fever with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd provided field medical care in situations where mistakes had permanent consequences. Besides, I used to be quite good with face paints back in the day. Jake looked up from wrestling with a folding table that seemed determined to remain folded. You did face painting before? I wouldn't have guessed that about you, Mrs. Rodriguez. You seem more like a crossword puzzle kind of person. Emma smiled at the observation because it was both accurate and completely inadequate as a description of who she'd been before she became the Cedar Falls librarian. People contain multitudes, Jake. Most of us have chapters in our stories that don't match the cover. She'd learned that lesson in places where assumptions about people's capabilities could mean the difference between successful missions and memorial services, where the quiet ones often proved most dangerous and the loudest ones folded under pressure. The morning continued with the familiar ballet of event preparation, volunteers arriving with contributions and questions, each person adding their piece to the collective effort that would transform an empty community center into the heart of Cedar Falls' social calendar. Frank and Betty Williams, married 62 years and still holding hands whenever they walked together, brought their famous apple pies and the kind of gentle wisdom that came from watching multiple generations grow up in the same small town. Betty's silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and Frank wore the kind of suspenders that had gone out of fashion everywhere except small Montana towns where practicality trumped trends. Emma dear, you've outdone yourself with the organization this year, Betty said, surveying the emerging festival setup with approval. Everything looks perfect as always. I don't know how you manage to keep track of all these details. It's just a matter of making lists and checking them twice, Emma replied, though the truth was more complicated than that. Her organizational skills had been honed in environments where forgetting details could compromise entire operations, where mission planning required accounting for variables most civilians never had to consider. The habits she'd developed in military intelligence had translated surprisingly well to coordinating bake sales and craft fairs, though the stakes were considerably lower and the consequences of mistakes more forgiving. Frank nodded approvingly at the arrangement of tables and booths. Reminds me of the church socials we used to have when I was a boy, before everything got so complicated. There's something to be said for keeping things simple and focusing on what brings people together rather than what drives them apart. Simple is often harder than complicated, Emma observed, making another note on her clipboard. It takes more work to strip away the unnecessary and focus on what actually matters. She'd learned that lesson in briefing rooms where complex situations had to be reduced to actionable intelligence, where the ability to identify essential information among overwhelming data streams could determine mission success or failure. As the morning progressed, Emma found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of problem-solving and people management that had always come naturally to her. She mediated a minor dispute between two craft vendors about table placement, suggested a solution for the malfunctioning sound system that had Jake staring at her with newfound respect, and somehow managed to transform what could have been a logistics nightmare into something approaching organized chaos. How did you know that would work? Jake asked after watching Emma diagnose and fix the audio equipment's feedback problem with the kind of technical precision that seemed incongruous with her librarian persona. That was like seriously impressive troubleshooting. Emma felt a familiar flutter of anxiety whenever someone noticed that her knowledge or skills seemed to extend beyond what her current life suggested they should. You pick things up along the way, she said vaguely, returning her attention to her clipboard before Jake could ask follow-up questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Libraries have all kinds of technical manuals if you know where to look. The excuse was thin, but Jake seemed to accept it with the casual indifference of someone young enough to assume that adults acquired random knowledge through mysterious processes he didn't need to understand. Emma had learned that most people were surprisingly willing to accept surface explanations, rather than dig deeper into questions that might complicate their simple understanding of the world around them. By noon, the Riverside Community Center had been transformed into a bustling marketplace of small-town craftsmanship and community spirit. Families began arriving early, children racing ahead of parents who walked more slowly, savoring the kind of afternoon that reminded everyone why they'd chosen to build their lives in a place where neighbors still mattered, and traditions persisted across generations. The apple cider booth drew its first customers, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg mixing with the sound of laughter and conversation to create the kind of atmosphere that existed in greeting cards and Norman Rockwell paintings. Emma positioned herself at the information table near the center's main entrance, a location that provided her with clear sightlines to every corner of the event, while maintaining the kind of background presence she'd cultivated since arriving in Cedar Falls. From this vantage point, she could monitor crowd flow, identify potential problems before they escalated, and provide assistance to visitors while remaining essentially invisible to anyone not actively seeking her help. The festival officially opened at 1 o'clock, and within minutes, the community center filled with the cheerful chaos of families exploring booths, children demanding face painting and balloon animals, and teenagers who'd been dragged to the event by parents, but were gradually discovering that small-town festivals possessed their own particular charm. Emma watched it all with the satisfied attention of someone who'd learned that successful operations were measured not by dramatic moments, but by the absence of problems that could have occurred but didn't. "Emma," called Rebecca Martinez, approaching the information table with the kind of breathless energy that suggested crisis or excitement. Rebecca taught 4th grade at Cedar Falls Elementary and possessed the teacher's gift for making everything sound like either the best or worst thing that had ever happened. "We have a situation with the cakewalk. The donated cakes aren't matching up with the numbers, and people are getting confused about the rules." Emma nodded calmly, already mentally organizing the solution. "Jake, can you take the information table for a few minutes? I need to sort out the cakewalk logistics." She handed him her clipboard and a pen, noting the way his chest puffed out slightly at being entrusted with official responsibility. "If anyone asks questions you can't answer, just tell them I'll be right back." "Got it, Mrs. Rodriguez." "You can count on me," Jake replied with the earnest determination of someone taking his first step into adult responsibility. Emma found his enthusiasm endearing, a reminder of her own younger self when every assignment had felt like an opportunity to prove her worth, and every success had seemed like validation of her potential. The cakewalk crisis turned out to be more organizational than actual emergency, requiring nothing more than renumbering displays and clarifying instructions with the kind of systematic approach that Emma applied to all problems, regardless of their scale or complexity. She'd learned in military service that the same methodical thinking that solved complex intelligence puzzles could be applied to any challenge, from coordinating multinational operations to managing small-town fundraisers. "How do you always know exactly what to do?" Rebecca asked as they finished reorganizing the cakewalk setup. "I swear, Emma, sometimes I think you could run the entire town if you wanted to. You have this way of seeing problems and solutions that the rest of us miss completely." Emma felt that familiar tightness in her chest whenever someone noticed capabilities that extended beyond her carefully constructed librarian persona. "It's just a matter of breaking problems down into manageable pieces," she replied, deflecting the compliment with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that drawing attention to her abilities could lead to questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Plus, I've had lots of practice organizing events. You develop an eye for potential problems after a while." The answer satisfied Rebecca's curiosity without revealing anything substantive about Emma's background or the specialized training that had taught her to see patterns and anticipate complications with the kind of precision that came from environments where mistakes had consequences more serious than confused cakewalk participants. Emma had perfected the art of being competent without being remarkable, helpful without being memorable, the kind of person who solved problems quietly and disappeared back into the background before anyone thought to ask how she'd known what to do. As the afternoon progressed, Emma found herself moving through the festival with the easy confidence of someone in complete control of her environment. She helped elderly visitors find chairs when they needed to rest, directed families to restrooms and first aid supplies, mediated minor disputes between children over balloon animals, and somehow managed to be everywhere she was needed without appearing to rush or stress about anything. Mrs. Rodriguez called Tommy Chen, Maria's 8-year-old son who'd arrived with his grandmother after school let out. "My mom said you were going to do face painting, but I don't see you at the booth. Are you still going to paint faces?" Emma looked toward the face painting station, where a small line of children had begun forming despite the absence of anyone to actually provide the service. She'd gotten so caught up in troubleshooting other people's problems that she'd forgotten her promise to Maria about covering the face painting booth. "Absolutely, Tommy. Let me just grab the supplies and we'll get started." She made her way to the face painting station, noting the expectant faces of children who'd been promised butterflies and superheroes and were prepared to be patient for approximately 30 more seconds before disappointment set in. Emma had never actually done face painting before, but she'd observed enough military camouflage application to understand the basic principles of applying paint to faces with precision and artistic intent. "Who wants to go first?" she asked, settling into the chair behind the small table loaded with brushes, sponges, and containers of washable paint in every color imaginable. A chorus of "me, me, me" rose from the assembled children, each one suddenly convinced that they'd been waiting longer than everyone else and deserved priority consideration. Emma smiled at their enthusiasm, remembering her own childhood impatience with anything that required waiting. "How about we start with the birthday girl?" she suggested, having noticed 6-year-old Sophie Henderson wearing a glittery tiara that suggested celebration. Sophie beamed and climbed into the chair opposite Emma, her face glowing with excitement and anticipation. "I want to be a princess," Sophie announced, as if this hadn't been obvious from her tiara, and the pink dress she wore with the kind of confidence that only came from being absolutely certain of one's own royal status. Emma picked up a thin brush and began sketching delicate lines across Sophie's cheek, her hand moving with the steady precision of someone accustomed to work that required millimeter accuracy. The princess design took shape under her fingers with surprising sophistication, incorporating shading and detail work that had the other children gasping with appreciation, and the supervising parents exchanging impressed glances. "Wow, Mrs. Rodriguez," breathed Jake, who'd abandoned the information table to watch Emma work. "That's incredible. You're really good at this. Where did you learn to paint like that?" Emma felt her stomach tighten at the question because the honest answer was that steady hands and precise brush control had been developed in military training facilities, where attention to detail could mean the difference between successful camouflage and compromised positions. "Just something I picked up along the way," she replied vaguely, focusing her attention on adding delicate flourishes to Sophie's princess transformation. The afternoon continued, with Emma working her way through the line of children, each face becoming a small canvas for increasingly elaborate designs that showcased technical skill and artistic ability far beyond what anyone expected from a small-town librarian who'd volunteered to help out with face painting. Dragons breathed fire across little boys' cheeks, butterflies spread intricate wings across little girls' foreheads, and superheroes emerged with the kind of detailed precision that had parents taking photos and children admiring themselves in hand mirrors with pure joy. "Emma, dear, you're quite the artist," observed Betty Williams, watching Emma apply finishing touches to elaborate tiger design on her grandson's face. "I had no idea you had such talent. Have you considered teaching art classes? The community center is always looking for new programs, and you clearly have a gift for this kind of work." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks because compliments about her abilities always made her uncomfortable, reminding her of commendations and recognition she'd received in her previous life for very different kinds of precision work. "It's just preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Of course, dear. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable with my curiosity. It's just that those of us who've lived in Cedar Falls for a long time tend to notice when someone brings unusual capabilities to our community, and we appreciate having neighbors with diverse skills and experiences." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Mitchell, who burst through the library's front door with the breathless energy of someone who'd run several blocks and had urgent news to share. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his flannel shirt partly untucked, and his hair sticking up at angles that suggested he'd dressed hastily and left his apartment without checking a mirror. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jake called out, approaching the circulation desk with obvious excitement. You're not going to believe what's happening at the community center. There are federal agents there, like actual FBI or something, asking questions about the festival and taking photographs of the building. People are saying they're investigating something that happened yesterday. Emma felt ice water replace the blood in her veins because Jake's news represented her worst nightmare coming true. Federal attention focused specifically on the community center, where she'd spent yesterday demonstrating organizational capabilities and precision skills that could have attracted exactly the kind of official notice she'd moved to Cedar Falls to avoid. Federal agents? Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice rising with the kind of alarm that came from someone who'd lived through enough decades to understand that federal investigations rarely ended well for small communities. What on earth could they be investigating at our little harvest festival? Jake shook his head, clearly frustrated by the limited information he'd been able to gather. Nobody knows for sure, but they've been there since early this morning, interviewing volunteers who helped with setup and asking specific questions about who organized different activities. Helen Miller said they seemed particularly interested in the logistics and coordination, like they were trying to figure out how everything ran so smoothly. Emma's mind raced through possibilities and implications, calculating risks and potential responses with the tactical thinking that had been drilled into her during years of high-stakes operations. Federal agents investigating the festival's organization would inevitably lead them to her role as coordinator, and any serious background check would reveal inconsistencies between her public persona and her classified service record that could compromise not only her own security, but potentially ongoing operations she'd been involved with during her military career. Did they mention what agency they represented? Emma asked, trying to keep her voice level despite the anxiety flooding her system. Or give any indication of what they're investigating. That's the weird part, Jake replied, clearly puzzled by the mysterious nature of the federal presence. They showed badges and identification, but nobody got a clear look at exactly which agency they're from. They're dressed like FBI, but they're asking questions like they're more interested in operational capabilities than criminal activity. Mrs. Patterson looked between Emma and Jake with growing concern, her expression suggesting she was beginning to understand that the federal investigation might be connected to yesterday's festival in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. Emma, dear, you organized yesterday's event. Have they contacted you yet about speaking with them? Emma felt her carefully controlled composure beginning to crack under the pressure of circumstances spiraling beyond her ability to manage or predict. Not yet, Mrs. Patterson. But I imagine they'll want to speak with all the key volunteers eventually. It's probably just routine follow-up on community events, making sure everything was conducted properly and safely. But even as she offered the reassuring explanation, Emma knew it was inadequate to account for the kind of federal attention Jake was describing. Routine community event follow-up didn't require multiple agents conducting detailed interviews about organizational capabilities and operational logistics. This level of official interest suggested that someone had identified her involvement in the festival and recognized capabilities that warranted further investigation. Mrs. Rodriguez, Jake said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. There's something else. Captain Hayes was there talking to the agents, and when I walked by, I heard him mention your name specifically. It sounded like they were already planning to interview you, like they knew exactly who you were and what role you'd played in organizing the festival. Emma felt the last vestiges of her cover story crumbling around her as the implications of Jake's information became clear. Captain Hayes hadn't just warned her about potential federal inquiries. He'd already been in contact with agents who were actively investigating her background and current activities. The conversation yesterday about emergency preparedness exercises had been more than friendly warning. It had been preparation for official scrutiny that was already underway. I should probably head over to the community center then, Emma said, though every instinct told her to run, rather than voluntarily walk into a federal investigation that could expose everything she'd worked to keep hidden. If they want to speak with me about the festival organization, it's better to be cooperative and straightforward about my involvement. Mrs. Patterson reached out to touch Emma's arm with the gentle concern of someone who'd spent decades nurturing young people through difficult situations. Emma, dear, you look quite pale. Are you feeling all right? Perhaps you should sit down for a moment before dealing with whatever questions these agents might have. Emma realized she was trembling slightly, her body betraying the anxiety she was trying to conceal through controlled responses and reasonable explanations. I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson, just concerned about what this investigation might mean for our community. Federal attention can be disruptive for small towns, even when there's nothing seriously wrong. Would you like me to come with you? Jake offered, his voice carrying the loyal concern of someone who'd come to respect Emma's leadership and wanted to support her during what was clearly a stressful situation. I mean, I was one of the main volunteers, so they'll probably want to interview me anyway. We could walk over together. Emma felt unexpected gratitude for Jake's offer because it represented exactly the kind of community support Captain Hayes had promised would be available regardless of whatever complications arose from her background. That's very kind of you, Jake. But I think it's better if I speak with them alone first. If they need to interview other volunteers, they'll make those arrangements themselves. She gathered her purse and jacket, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every action from this point forward would be scrutinized and analyzed by people trained to read behavior and detect deception. The ballistics manual remained on her desk, a silent reminder that forces beyond her control were already moving to expose secrets she'd spent years protecting. Emma, Mrs. Patterson called out as Emma reached the library's front door. Whatever questions these agents might have, remember that you've been nothing but an asset to this community. Cedar Falls is lucky to have you, and will support you through whatever complications might arise. Emma felt tears threaten at the unexpected kindness in Mrs. Patterson's words, because they echoed Captain Hayes's promise that community acceptance didn't depend on perfect transparency about past experiences or current capabilities. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means more to me than you know. The walk to the community center felt both endless and too short, giving Emma time to prepare mentally for an interrogation that could determine whether she'd be able to continue her quiet life in Cedar Falls or would be forced to abandon everything she'd built over the past 7 years. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke, normal seasonal changes that seemed surreal against the backdrop of federal investigation and potential exposure of classified information. 2 black SUVs were parked outside the community center, their government plates and tinted windows confirming that Jake's description of federal agents hadn't been exaggerated or misunderstood. Emma could see figures moving inside the building, their purposeful activity suggesting a serious investigation rather than routine community outreach or casual follow-up questioning. Agent Jennifer Walsh met Emma at the community center entrance, her appearance and demeanor immediately identifying her as someone with significant law enforcement experience and authority to conduct investigations that extended far beyond local jurisdiction. Walsh was approximately Emma's age, with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of controlled alertness that came from years of high-stakes professional responsibility. Ms. Rodriguez, Walsh said, extending her credentials for inspection. I'm Agent Walsh with the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. We'd like to speak with you about your role in organizing yesterday's community festival, and about your background and current activities here in Cedar Falls. Emma examined the credentials carefully, noting that Walsh represented military rather than civilian law enforcement, which suggested the investigation was connected to Emma's service record rather than general community security concerns. Of course, Agent Walsh. I'm happy to answer any questions about the festival organization or my involvement in community activities. Walsh gestured toward a quiet corner of the community center, where 2 chairs had been arranged for private conversation, the setup suggesting an interview that would be more formal and comprehensive than casual questioning about festival logistics. We appreciate your cooperation, Ms. Rodriguez. This shouldn't take too long, but we do need to verify some information about your background and current circumstances. Emma settled into the chair facing Walsh, automatically cataloging exit routes and potential complications while maintaining the cooperative demeanor of someone with nothing to hide. What specific information do you need, Agent Walsh? I'm not sure how my background relates to festival organization, but I'm certainly willing to provide whatever clarification might be helpful. Walsh consulted a thick file folder that Emma recognized as the kind of comprehensive background documentation that accompanied serious federal investigations. Ms. Rodriguez, according to our records, you served in the United States Army from 2010 to 2017, achieving the rank of Staff Sergeant and receiving specialized training in intelligence gathering and precision marksmanship. Your service included multiple deployments to classified locations and participation in operations that remain classified at the highest levels of national security. Emma felt her carefully maintained cover story disintegrating completely as Walsh recited information that she'd never disclosed to anyone in Cedar Falls and had hoped would remain buried in classified files accessible only to people with legitimate need-to-know clearances. Agent Walsh, I did serve in the Army during those years, but I'm not sure I understand how my military service relates to your investigation or why classified information would be relevant to questions about community festival organization. Walsh leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting to the kind of intense focus that suggested Emma's response had confirmed rather than deflected the agent's suspicions. Ms. Rodriguez, during your military service, you established what remains the longest confirmed precision shot in United States military history. 4,200 meters under combat conditions in Afghanistan. That achievement, along with your specialized intelligence training, resulted in your assignment to classified operations that continue to have national security implications. Emma felt the room spinning slightly as Walsh revealed information that she'd never expected to hear spoken aloud in civilian contexts, details about her military achievements that had been classified specifically to protect both operational security and her personal safety after she'd left active duty. Agent Walsh, I'm not sure where you're getting this information, but I think there may be some confusion about my service record and background. There's no confusion, Ms. Rodriguez, Walsh replied firmly, opening the file folder to reveal photographs and documents that Emma recognized as authentic records of her military service and classified achievements. What concerns us is that someone with your specialized capabilities and classified background has been living in this remote community for 7 years without any official oversight or monitoring, and yesterday's festival demonstration of your organizational and precision skills has raised questions about your current activities and potential security risks. Emma realized that denial was no longer possible or productive, that Walsh possessed too much accurate information for deflection or misdirection to be effective strategies. Agent Walsh, I completed my military service honorably and chose to begin civilian life in Cedar Falls because I wanted to contribute to a community in peaceful ways. I've never engaged in any activities that could compromise national security or violate the terms of my service obligations. Walsh studied Emma's face with the practiced attention of someone trained to detect deception and evaluate credibility under pressure. Ms. Rodriguez, we're not suggesting that you violated any laws or engaged in inappropriate activities. However, someone with your background and capabilities represents a potential security asset that shouldn't be operating without official oversight, particularly in a region that could become strategically significant if current geopolitical tensions escalate. Emma felt cold dread settling in her stomach as she began to understand that this investigation wasn't about past violations or current wrongdoing, but about potential future utilization of her specialized skills for purposes she'd thought she'd left behind forever. Agent Walsh, I chose civilian life specifically because I wanted to leave military operations behind. I'm not interested in returning to any kind of official or unofficial government service. Unfortunately, Ms. Rodriguez, Walsh said, her tone carrying the regret of someone delivering unwelcome news. People with your level of specialized training and proven capabilities don't always have the luxury of choosing permanent retirement from service to their country. Current international situations may require the activation of all available assets with relevant skills and experience. Emma felt the peaceful life she'd built in Cedar Falls slipping away, as Walsh's words made clear that her military past had caught up with her in ways that threatened not only her personal anonymity, but her ability to maintain the quiet civilian existence she'd treasured for 7 years. What exactly are you asking me to do, Agent Walsh? For now, we're asking you to remain available and continue your normal activities while we complete our assessment of current security requirements and potential utilization of your capabilities, Walsh replied, closing the file folder but leaving it on the table between them as a reminder of the classified information that connected Emma's past to her present circumstances. We'll be in touch within the next few days with more specific information about expectations and requirements. Emma nodded slowly, understanding that she had no choice but to comply with Walsh's instructions, while hoping that the assessment process might somehow conclude that her specialized skills weren't needed for whatever operations the government was contemplating. I understand, Agent Walsh. Will I be able to continue my work at the library and my involvement in community activities? Absolutely, Walsh assured her, though her tone suggested these permissions came with conditions and limitations that hadn't been fully explained. In fact, Maintaining your normal routine and community connections is essential for operational security purposes. Any dramatic changes in your behavior or circumstances could attract unwanted attention and compromise ongoing assessments. As Walsh gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Emma felt the weight of uncertainty settling over her like a physical force. The careful balance she'd maintained between her past and present was gone forever, replaced by official scrutiny that could lead anywhere from renewed military service to permanent relocation away from the community she'd come to love. "Ms. Rodriguez," Walsh said as she stood to leave, "I want you to understand that your service to this country has been exemplary, and your contributions to this community demonstrate exactly the kind of character and dedication that make you valuable as both a citizen and a potential asset. Whatever decisions are made about your future involvement in government service, those decisions will be made with full appreciation for your past sacrifices and current circumstances." Emma watched Walsh leave the community center, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again, but hoping that somehow she might be able to preserve at least some aspects of the peaceful life she'd built in Cedar Falls. The morning sun still painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, but the beauty of the landscape now felt fragile and temporary, threatened by forces beyond her control and complicated by loyalties she'd thought she'd left behind forever. The emergency preparedness exercise Captain Hayes had mentioned suddenly took on new significance, transforming from potential inconvenience to inevitable test of capabilities that federal agents were already documenting and analyzing. Emma realized that her participation would no longer be optional, that her performance would be scrutinized for evidence of skills that could be utilized for purposes she'd spent 7 years trying to avoid. As she walked back toward the library, Emma's mind raced through possibilities and implications, calculating risks and potential responses with the tactical thinking that had never truly left her despite 7 years of civilian life. The ballistics manual waiting on her desk now seemed like a message rather than coincidence, a reminder that her specialized knowledge and proven capabilities made her valuable to people who had the authority to require her service regardless of her personal preferences. The peaceful routine of library work and community involvement that had defined her life in Cedar Falls suddenly felt like a temporary reprieve rather than permanent escape from the classified world she'd thought she'd left behind. Emma understood that the next few days would determine whether she'd be able to maintain any semblance of the quiet life she'd built, or would be forced to return to the kind of high-stakes operations that had defined her military career and shaped her into someone capable of achievements that remained classified at the highest levels of national security. Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but Emma knew that everything had changed in ways that couldn't be undone or reversed. The federal investigation had exposed secrets she'd spent years protecting, connected her past to her present in ways that threatened her ability to continue living as the quiet librarian who organized community festivals and helped families find good books to read together. But even as uncertainty and anxiety flooded her system, Emma felt a strange sense of relief that the careful self-monitoring and constant vigilance required to maintain her cover story was finally over. For the first time in 7 years, someone knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of, and that knowledge brought both danger and the possibility of being valued for her true capabilities rather than her carefully constructed civilian persona. The question now was whether the federal government would allow her to continue serving her community in peaceful ways, or would require her to return to the kind of classified operations that had made her the holder of records that remained too sensitive for public disclosure. Emma walked back toward the library knowing that her answer would determine not only her own future, but potentially the safety and security of the community she'd come to love, and the people who'd accepted her without ever knowing the full truth about who she really was. Agent Walsh's black SUV disappeared around the corner, leaving Cedar Falls looking deceptively normal and peaceful despite the morning's revelations about federal investigations and national security assessments. Emma understood that the appearance of normalcy was itself part of the operational security requirements that would govern her life from this point forward, that maintaining her routine and community connections had become a matter of official policy rather than personal choice. The library waited for her return, filled with books and patrons and the familiar responsibilities of civilian life that had given her 7 years of peace and purpose. But now those responsibilities carried additional weight, serving not only her genuine desire to contribute to the community, but also the federal government's interest in maintaining her cover while they assessed her potential value for future operations. Emma climbed the steps to the library's front entrance, knowing that she was crossing a threshold that separated her old life from whatever would come next, but hoping that somehow she might be able to preserve the relationships and sense of belonging that had made Cedar Falls feel like home. The door chimed as she entered, announcing her return to a world that looked exactly the same but had been fundamentally altered by forces beyond her control and revelations that couldn't be undone. Mrs. Patterson looked up from the reading area where she'd been waiting for Emma's return, her expression carrying the kind of concerned attention that suggested she understood the morning's events had been more significant than routine questioning about festival organization. "Emma, dear, how did your meeting with the federal agents go? You look quite shaken." Emma managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, understanding that her response would be the first test of her ability to maintain normal community relationships while operating under federal oversight and potential future obligations. "It was fine, Mrs. Patterson. Just routine questions about the festival organization and community activities. Nothing to worry about." But even as she offered the reassuring explanation, Emma knew that everything had changed in ways that would affect not only her own future, but her ability to continue being the person Cedar Falls had come to know and trust. The quiet librarian who organized community events and helped families find good books was still real, but she was no longer the complete picture of who Emma Rodriguez actually was, or what she might be called upon to become in service to her country and the communities she'd sworn to protect. The emergency call came at 2:47 on a Thursday afternoon when the autumn light was already beginning to fade behind the mountains, and Emma was helping a group of elementary school children select books for their weekly reading assignment. The piercing wail of Cedar Falls' emergency siren cut through the library's usual quiet atmosphere, causing every head to turn toward the windows and creating the kind of immediate tension that transformed ordinary moments into something urgent and potentially dangerous. Emma felt her body respond automatically to the emergency signal, muscles tensing and senses sharpening with the kind of instantaneous alertness that had been drilled into her during years of high-stakes operations where seconds could determine outcomes. She moved toward the library's emergency radio with practiced efficiency, her civilian demeanor shifting subtly into something more focused and tactically aware, while maintaining enough normalcy to avoid alarming the children who looked to her for reassurance. "This is Cedar Falls Emergency Management," crackled the voice of Captain Hayes through the radio's static, his tone carrying the controlled urgency of someone managing a crisis that required immediate response from multiple agencies. "We have a confirmed hostage situation. All emergency personnel report to designated staging areas immediately." Emma felt ice water replace the blood in her veins as she processed the implications of Hayes' announcement. Miller's coffee shop sat directly across from the library, its large front windows providing clear sightlines between the two buildings, but also exposing anyone inside to potential crossfire if the situation escalated beyond negotiation. The coffee shop served as Cedar Falls' unofficial community center, always filled with families, elderly residents, and teenagers who gathered there after school to socialize and study. "Mrs. Rodriguez," whispered Sarah Chen, Tommy's younger sister who'd been reaching for a picture book when the siren began wailing. "What's happening? Why does everyone look scared?" Her 8-year-old voice carried the kind of innocent confusion that reminded Emma why she'd chosen to build her civilian life around protecting and nurturing, rather than the tactical objectives that had defined her military service. Emma knelt beside Sarah, automatically positioning herself between the child and the windows that faced Miller's coffee shop, while maintaining the calm authority that had made her trusted by Cedar Falls families. "There's some trouble across the street, Sarah, but we're going to make sure everyone stays safe here in the library. Can you help me gather the other children in the back room, where we keep the storytime supplies?" The request gave Sarah a specific task that would keep her occupied and away from windows while allowing Emma to begin implementing security protocols without creating panic among the civilian population she needed to protect. Emma's military training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging defensive positions, potential escape routes, and tactical considerations, while her external demeanor remained focused on community safety and child welfare. Through the library's front windows, Emma could see law enforcement vehicles arriving at the coffee shop, with the controlled urgency of professionals responding to a situation that could escalate rapidly if not managed properly. Sheriff's deputies established a perimeter around the building while state police units positioned themselves at strategic locations that would provide tactical advantages if negotiations failed and direct action became necessary. Emma recognized the scene developing across the street as exactly the kind of high-stakes crisis that required specialized skills and precision decision-making under extreme pressure. Her hands moved automatically to check her phone, muscle memory from military service making her reach for communication equipment, even though her current role as a civilian librarian provided no official authority or responsibility in law enforcement operations. Agent Walsh appeared at the library's front entrance with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been monitoring the situation and had specific objectives for Emma's involvement. Walsh's arrival confirmed Emma's growing suspicion that the hostage crisis wasn't coincidental timing, but rather the kind of emergency scenario that would test her capabilities and determine her value for future federal operations. "Ms. Rodriguez," Walsh said quietly, approaching Emma with an expression that suggested urgent business rather than casual conversation. "We need to talk immediately. The situation across the street has created circumstances that require your specialized expertise, and time is a critical factor in determining outcomes for the civilians being held hostage." Emma felt her carefully maintained civilian identity crumbling completely, as Walsh's words made clear that her military background and classified capabilities were about to be activated for operational purposes she'd spent 7 years trying to avoid. "Agent Walsh, I'm responsible for the safety of children and community members here in the library. Whatever situation is developing across the street, my priority has to be protecting the civilians under my immediate care." Walsh nodded approvingly at Emma's response, her expression suggesting that concern for civilian safety was exactly the kind of character trait that made Emma valuable for the kind of operations the federal government was contemplating. "Ms. Rodriguez, the children and library patrons will be evacuated to secure locations by local law enforcement. Your expertise is needed for tactical assessment and potential precision intervention that could determine whether the hostages across the street survive the next hour." Emma looked through the windows toward Miller's coffee shop, where she could see figures moving behind the glass and emergency personnel establishing positions that suggested preparation for either extended negotiation or tactical assault. Her specialized training allowed her to read the scene with professional accuracy, recognizing signs that indicated the situation was deteriorating beyond the capabilities of local law enforcement to resolve safely. "What's the tactical situation?" Emma asked, her voice shifting automatically into the kind of professional tone she'd used during military briefings when lives depended on accurate information and precise decision-making. "How many hostiles, how many civilians, what kind of weapons and defensive positions are we dealing with?" Walsh consulted a tablet displaying real-time intelligence gathered by federal surveillance assets that had been deployed to monitor the crisis. "Single hostile, male, approximately 35 years old, armed with hunting rifle and handgun. 6 confirmed civilians, including elderly coffee shop owner Helen Miller, and 4 customers ranging in age from 16 to 73. Hostile has positioned himself with clear sightlines to all entrances and has threatened to begin executing hostages if law enforcement attempts direct assault." Emma processed the tactical information with the kind of systematic analysis that had made her legendary among military snipers for her ability to solve complex shooting problems under extreme pressure. The coffee shop's layout, the hostile's defensive position, the presence of multiple innocent civilians, and the time pressure created by escalating threats combined to form exactly the kind of scenario that required capabilities beyond conventional law enforcement response. "What's the range from potential shooting positions to target area?" Emma asked, though she was already calculating distances and angles based on her intimate knowledge of Cedar Falls geography and the tactical considerations that would determine feasibility of precision intervention. "Approximately 800 meters from the bell tower of St. Mary's Church to the coffee shop interior," Walsh replied, her tone suggesting she'd anticipated Emma's question and had already identified the optimal shooting position for someone with Emma's specialized capabilities. Local law enforcement lacks both the equipment and expertise for precision shots at that range under these conditions. Emma felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders as she understood that Walsh was asking her to return to exactly the kind of high-stakes tactical operations she'd left behind when she'd chosen civilian life in Cedar Falls. Using her sniper skills to resolve the hostage crisis would save innocent lives, but would also expose her true capabilities to the entire community and eliminate any possibility of maintaining her quiet librarian identity. "Agent Walsh," Emma said quietly, "if I provide tactical support for this operation, there's no going back to my civilian life here. Everyone in Cedar Falls will know exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. The peaceful anonymity I've built over 7 years will be gone forever. Walsh studied Emma's face with the kind of professional assessment that suggested she understood the personal cost of what she was requesting, while also recognizing that operational necessity might override individual preferences. Ms. Rodriguez, 6 innocent people are going to die in the next 30 minutes unless someone with your capabilities intervenes. That's the immediate reality we're facing, regardless of longer-term consequences for your personal circumstances. Emma looked across the street toward Miller's coffee shop, where she could see Helen Miller's face pressed against the window with the kind of terror that reminded her why she'd originally chosen military service over safer alternatives. Helen had welcomed Emma to Cedar Falls 7 years ago, had provided free coffee during Emma's first difficult weeks in a new community, had been one of the first people to make Emma feel genuinely accepted and valued for who she appeared to be, rather than judged for what she couldn't explain about her background. "What equipment is available?" Emma asked, her decision crystallizing around the fundamental truth that protecting innocent lives mattered more than preserving her own anonymity or avoiding complications that might arise from exposing her specialized capabilities. Walsh smiled with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from securing cooperation for operations that required unique expertise. Military-grade precision rifle, specialized optics, environmental monitoring equipment, communication systems that will allow real-time coordination with tactical teams. Everything you need to make shots that local law enforcement can't even attempt. Emma nodded slowly, understanding that accepting Walsh's request would transform her from protected civilian back into operational asset with all the responsibilities and risks that classification entailed. "I'll need 15 minutes to study the tactical situation, verify equipment specifications, and coordinate with local law enforcement to ensure civilian safety during the operation." "You'll have whatever time and resources you need," Walsh assured her, though her tone suggested that 15 minutes represented the outer limit of available time before the situation deteriorated beyond any possibility of successful resolution. Transport to the church bell tower is already arranged, and federal communications equipment will allow you to maintain contact with all tactical elements throughout the operation. Emma turned toward the library's back room where she'd sent the children to wait in safety, knowing that she needed to ensure their continued protection before leaving to assume responsibilities that would expose her to exactly the kind of official attention she'd spent years avoiding. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to keep the children calm and safe until law enforcement can evacuate you to secure locations. Can you handle that responsibility?" Mrs. Patterson nodded with the kind of determined courage that had carried her through decades of teaching and community service, her expression suggesting she understood that Emma was about to undertake something dangerous and important. "Of course, dear. You do whatever you need to do and don't worry about us. We'll be fine here until help arrives." Emma felt unexpected emotion rise in her throat as she realized that Mrs. Patterson's response represented exactly the kind of community trust and support that had made Cedar Falls feel like home, and that she was about to risk losing forever by exposing capabilities that would change how everyone saw her. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Take care of the children." The ride to St. Mary's Church took less than 5 minutes, but the time passed with the surreal quality of a dream where familiar landscapes transformed into tactical environments that required professional assessment rather than civilian appreciation. Emma found herself automatically cataloging wind conditions, light angles, potential interference factors, and the 100 other variables that would determine whether she could achieve the kind of precision shooting that would resolve the crisis without endangering innocent lives. Agent Walsh had arranged for federal tactical equipment that Emma recognized as significantly superior to anything available through normal law enforcement channels. The precision rifle represented the latest military technology, equipped with advanced optics and environmental monitoring systems that would provide real-time data about conditions affecting long-range accuracy. Emma's hands moved over the equipment with the kind of practiced familiarity that came from years of specialized training and operational experience. "Ms. Rodriguez," said the federal tactical coordinator who'd been managing equipment preparation, "wind conditions are variable but manageable. Lighting is optimal for precision work, and we have real-time intelligence about hostile position and civilian locations. You'll have communication with hostage negotiators so you can time your shot to coordinate with tactical diversion that will minimize risk to innocent parties." Emma nodded as she completed her equipment check, her civilian identity dissolving completely as she transitioned into the professional mindset that had made her legendary among military snipers for her ability to achieve impossible shots under extreme pressure. The church bell tower provided an elevated position with clear sightlines to Miller's coffee shop, though the 800-meter distance and need for precision that would neutralize the threat without endangering hostages created exactly the kind of challenge that had established her reputation for achieving what other snipers considered impossible. Through the advanced optics, Emma could see the interior of the coffee shop with startling clarity. Helen Miller sat in a chair near the counter, her hands zip-tied behind her back and her face showing the kind of exhausted terror that came from hours of uncertainty about whether she would survive the afternoon. 4 other civilians were positioned around the shop in ways that suggested the hostile had carefully arranged them to complicate any law enforcement response. The hostile himself moved with the jerky unpredictability of someone under the influence of substances that had eliminated normal judgment and self-preservation instincts. His positioning near the front windows provided him with clear views of law enforcement activities while using the civilian hostages as human shields that would prevent conventional tactical assault. Emma recognized the scenario as exactly the kind of complex shooting problem that required capabilities beyond normal law enforcement training. "Negotiator reports hostile is becoming increasingly agitated," crackled the voice of the tactical coordinator through Emma's earpiece. "Demands are escalating, and timeline for resolution is compressing rapidly. We may have less than 10 minutes before he begins executing hostages to demonstrate his willingness to follow through on threats." Emma adjusted her position slightly, finding the optimal angle that would allow her to neutralize the threat while minimizing any possibility of collateral damage to innocent civilians. Her breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that had been drilled into her during years of specialized training, her heartbeat slowing to the steady pace that allowed for precision work under extreme pressure. Through the scope, she could see the hostile's finger resting on the trigger of his rifle as he gestured wildly at something outside Emma's field of view. His movements had become increasingly erratic over the past few minutes, suggesting that whatever substances were driving his behavior were reaching peak effect and making him more dangerous and unpredictable with each passing moment. "Target is exhibiting signs of extreme agitation and potential for immediate violence against civilians," Emma reported through her communication system, her voice carrying the professional calm that had characterized her military service even during the most high-stakes operations. "Recommend immediate authorization for precision intervention before situation deteriorates beyond recovery." "Authorization granted," came the immediate response from Federal Tactical Command. "You are cleared to engage target when optimal opportunity presents itself. All tactical elements are standing by to provide immediate medical and security response following your shot." Emma felt the familiar sensation of time slowing as she entered the mental state that had made her legendary among military snipers for her ability to achieve shots that other specialists considered impossible. The world outside her scope faded away until nothing existed, except the technical challenge of placing a single bullet with the kind of precision that would resolve the crisis while preserving every innocent life that depended on her capabilities. The shot presented itself when the hostile moved toward Helen Miller, with obvious intent to demonstrate his willingness to execute hostages if his demands weren't met immediately. Emma's training and instincts synchronized in the split second when the target was positioned optimally for neutralization without any possibility of collateral damage to innocent civilians. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder with a familiar force she'd experienced thousands of times during training and operational deployments. But this shot carried emotional weight that military missions had never possessed, because she was protecting people she knew personally, people who'd welcomed her into their community and accepted her as family. The bullet traveled 800 meters in less than 1 second, guided by calculations and adjustments that had been perfected through years of specialized training and proven in combat conditions across multiple deployments. Through the scope, Emma watched the hostile collapse immediately, his weapons falling harmlessly away from the civilians he'd been threatening to execute. The precision of the shot had been exactly what was required. Instant neutralization of the threat, with no possibility of continued danger to innocent people who'd been caught in circumstances beyond their control or ability to resolve. "Target down, civilians secure," Emma reported through her communication system, though her voice carried a tremor that reflected the emotional impact of using lethal skills to protect people she cared about personally. "All hostages appear uninjured and are ready for extraction by tactical teams." Law enforcement response was immediate and professional. with tactical teams entering the coffee shop to secure the scene and provide medical attention to civilians who'd been traumatized by hours of uncertainty and terror. Emma watched through her scope as Helen Miller was helped to her feet by paramedics, her face showing the kind of relief that came from surviving something that could easily have ended differently. "Outstanding work, Ms. Rodriguez," came the voice of Agent Walsh through Emma's earpiece, her tone carrying professional satisfaction mixed with recognition of the personal cost Emma had paid to resolve the crisis successfully. "Your precision and timing were exactly what the situation required. 6 innocent lives were saved by your willingness to act when conventional law enforcement lacked the capabilities to protect them." Emma began disassembling her equipment with the methodical efficiency that had characterized her military service, though her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline of operational stress began to subside and the reality of what she'd done settled into her consciousness. She'd saved innocent lives, protected people she cared about, and demonstrated exactly the kind of capabilities that had made her valuable to military operations across multiple deployments. But she'd also exposed herself completely to a community that had accepted her as a quiet librarian who organized festivals and helped children find good books to read. Everyone in Cedar Falls would now know that their friendly neighborhood librarian possessed the kind of specialized training and proven capabilities that had enabled her to achieve what law enforcement professionals couldn't even attempt. "What happens now?" Emma asked as she completed her equipment breakdown, though she suspected Walsh's answer would confirm her fears about losing the peaceful civilian life she'd treasured for 7 years. "Now you return to your normal routine while we complete our assessment of current security requirements and determine how your capabilities might be utilized for future operations," Walsh replied, her tone suggesting that Emma's demonstration of tactical skills had confirmed federal interest in returning her to active operational status. "What you accomplished today proves that retirement from government service isn't always permanent for people with your specialized training and proven abilities." Emma nodded slowly, understanding that the hostage crisis had served as both emergency response and evaluation of her current capabilities under operational stress. She'd passed the test by saving innocent lives, but success had also eliminated any possibility of maintaining the anonymous civilian identity she'd spent 7 years constructing and protecting. The ride back to the library felt like traveling between 2 different worlds. The classified realm of federal operations, where her specialized skills made her valuable for purposes she couldn't control, and the peaceful community life where she'd found acceptance and belonging, based on who she'd chosen to become, rather than what she'd been trained to accomplish. Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Her shot from the church bell tower had saved 6 innocent lives, but it had also ended forever her ability to live quietly among people who saw her as nothing more than their helpful librarian who made excellent face paintings and organized wonderful community festivals. The library waited for her return, filled with children and families who would now look at her differently, who would see her through the lens of what she'd accomplished, rather than who she'd appeared to be during 7 years of careful civilian performance. Emma understood that she'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, that her demonstration of specialized capabilities had changed permanently her relationship with the community she'd come to love. Agent Walsh's black SUV followed her back to the library, a reminder that federal oversight would now be a permanent feature of her life, rather than distant threat to her carefully maintained anonymity. Emma had saved innocent lives, protected her community, and proven that her specialized training retained operational value even after years of civilian disuse. But she'd also lost forever the quiet peace that had made Cedar Falls feel like home, replacing it with the kind of official attention and operational responsibility she'd moved to rural Montana specifically to avoid. The trade-off had been necessary and morally justified, but it represented the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. The confrontation with her father took place in his Scottsdale mansion, the same house where he'd delivered his ultimatum 7 years earlier. Robert Martinez looked older now, his silver hair whiter, his shoulders carrying the weight of a construction empire that had made him one of Arizona's wealthiest men. But his eyes held the same steel that had intimidated boardrooms and broken competitors for decades. "You look successful," he said as Rachel entered his study, gesturing to her tailored suit and diamond watch. "I assume you've come to thank me for pushing you toward greatness." Rachel placed the hospital bracelet on his mahogany desk, watching his face carefully. "I've come to ask you about the night you tried to murder my daughter." Robert's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his whiskey glass. I don't know what you're talking about. Sophia didn't die naturally, Rachel said, her voice deadly calm. You went to the hospital and used your influence to have her life support discontinued. You told them the family had decided to let nature take its course, except you weren't her family. I was. Robert stood and walked to his window, looking out at the landscaped grounds that his money had carved from desert wasteland. You were 22 years old, pregnant by a man who didn't want you, with no money and no prospects. That baby would have ruined any chance you had at a real life. That baby was my daughter, Rachel shot back, standing as well. She had a name. Sophia. She was alive. And you decided she shouldn't be. And look what you accomplished without that burden, Robert said, turning to face her. $3 billion, Forbes covers, technology that's changing the world. Would you have built any of that while changing diapers and worrying about daycare? Rachel felt rage building in her chest like a wildfire. You don't get to make that choice for me. You don't get to decide what my life should look like or what burdens I can handle. I saved you from a mistake that would have cost you everything, Robert insisted. That baby would have trapped you in poverty, tied you to a life of struggling and scraping just to survive. Instead, you became someone who matters. Hayes glanced around the community center, noting the families still present and the volunteers within earshot. Perhaps we could step outside? It's a private matter related to some county business I'm working on. Emma's training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging exit routes and potential threats, while her external demeanor remained calm and cooperative. Certainly. Jake, can you finish up here? I need to speak with Captain Hayes for a few minutes. They walked outside into the crisp autumn air, Hayes leading her away from the community center entrance to a spot near the parking area where their conversation wouldn't be overheard by festival attendees or volunteers. The setting sun painted the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls in shades of purple and gold, creating the kind of breathtaking vista that reminded Emma why she'd chosen this remote location for her new life. Emma, I'll get straight to the point, Hayes said, his tone carrying the gravity of someone delivering important information. I've received some inquiries about you from people who seem to know more about your background than most folks around here do. Questions about your military service, your previous assignments, your current activities. Emma felt ice water replace the blood in her veins because this was the conversation she'd been dreading for 7 years, the inevitable moment when her carefully constructed new identity would collide with the classified life she'd left behind. I'm not sure what you mean, Captain Hayes. I've never made any secret of the fact that I served in the military before coming to Cedar Falls. Hayes studied her face with the practiced attention of someone trained to read people under pressure. No, you haven't made it a secret. But you also haven't been particularly forthcoming about the details, have you? Most veterans are happy to talk about their service, share stories about their deployments, connect with other vets in the community. You've always been remarkably vague about your military experience. Emma chose her words carefully, drawing on years of experience providing information that was technically truthful while revealing nothing substantive. Some people process their military service differently than others, Captain Hayes. Not everyone finds it easy to talk about their experiences, especially if those experiences involve difficult deployments or challenging assignments. That's certainly true, Hayes acknowledged, but his expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with her explanation. The thing is, Emma, the people asking about you aren't casual inquiries from curious neighbors. These are official channels, federal agencies with legitimate reasons for wanting to verify your current status and activities. That suggests your military service might have involved more than standard deployments to challenging locations. Emma felt the carefully constructed walls of her new life beginning to crumble around her, but she maintained her composure with the discipline that had been drilled into her during years of high-pressure situations. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Captain Hayes, but I can assure you that I'm exactly who I appear to be. A librarian who enjoys organizing community events and helping families find good books to read together. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the kind of attention that made Emma acutely aware of every micro-expression and unconscious gesture that might reveal more than she intended. Emma, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you deserve honesty, and because I suspect you're capable of handling difficult conversations. The inquiries I've received suggest that your previous military service involved classified assignments at a very high level. The kind of assignments that don't just disappear from official records, even when someone wants to start fresh in a new location. Emma felt her carefully maintained cover story cracking under the pressure of Hayes' persistence, but she held to her position because admitting anything would open doors she'd spent years keeping closed. I appreciate your directness, Captain Hayes, but I'm afraid you've been given inaccurate information about my background. I served my country honorably in standard military positions, completed my service obligations, and chose to begin civilian life in Cedar Falls because I wanted to contribute to a community that values the kind of quiet service that makes everyday life better for families. Hayes nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he was processing her response as carefully crafted deflection rather than straightforward denial. Emma, I want you to know that whatever questions people might have about your past, you've proven yourself to be exactly the kind of community member Cedar Falls is lucky to have. Your contributions to this town, your dedication to helping your neighbors, your commitment to making life better for everyone around you. Those things speak louder than any questions about previous assignments or classifications. Emma felt unexpected emotion rise in her throat because Hayes' words touched on the deepest fear that had driven her to Cedar Falls, that her value as a person might be forever defined by the things she'd done in service to her country rather than the person she'd chosen to become afterward. Thank you, Captain Hayes. That means more to me than you might realize. However, Hayes continued, his tone shifting back to official business. I need you to understand that the inquiries I've received aren't going to disappear just because we don't talk about them. Federal agencies don't usually lose interest in people they're tracking, especially people with the kind of background that generates official curiosity about current activities and associations. Emma felt the weight of her past pressing down on her like a physical force, threatening to crush the peaceful life she'd built in Cedar Falls under the accumulated pressure of secrets she'd never intended to carry forever. What exactly are you asking me to do, Captain Hayes? I'm asking you to be prepared, Hayes replied, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the implications of what he was saying. Prepared for the possibility that your past and present might not stay separated forever. Prepared for questions that might be difficult to answer without compromising the life you've built here. Prepared for decisions that might force you to choose between the person you were and the person you've become. Emma nodded slowly, understanding that this conversation represented the end of one chapter of her life in Cedar Falls and the beginning of something much more complicated and uncertain. I understand, Captain Hayes, and I appreciate the warning, even though I'm not sure there's anything I can do with it except hope that whoever's asking questions will eventually lose interest and move on to more pressing concerns. Emma, Hayes said quietly, his official tone softening into something more personal. I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever questions arise about your background or your previous assignments, you have friends in this community who value you for who you are right now, not who you might have been before. Cedar Falls is lucky to have you, and that's not going to change regardless of what federal agencies might want to know about your service record. Emma felt tears threaten at the unexpected kindness in Hayes' words, because she'd spent so many years believing that acceptance and belonging were luxuries she'd forfeited when she'd chosen to leave her previous life behind. Thank you, Captain Hayes. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun complete its descent behind the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls, both of them understanding that this conversation had changed something fundamental about Emma's place in the community and her ability to maintain the careful anonymity she'd cultivated for 7 years. I should get back inside, Emma said finally, gesturing toward the community center where Jake was probably wondering what had happened to her and why she'd disappeared in the middle of cleanup duties. There's still work to do, and the volunteers have already done more than enough for one day. Hayes nodded, but his expression suggested their conversation wasn't finished even though the immediate business had been addressed. Emma, there's one more thing I need to mention, something that might become relevant sooner rather than later. The county is organizing a regional emergency preparedness exercise next month, a multi-agency training event that will involve law enforcement, fire services, medical response teams, and specialized units from across the state. Emma felt her stomach tighten because emergency preparedness exercises had a way of revealing capabilities and knowledge that people preferred to keep private. That sounds like important work, Captain Hayes, but I'm not sure how it relates to our conversation or my situation. The exercise will include scenarios that require specialized skills, Hayes continued, his tone carefully neutral. marksmanship evaluations, tactical assessments, precision shooting challenges that will test participants' abilities under pressure. The kind of evaluations that might reveal interesting information about people's backgrounds and training levels. Emma understood immediately what Hayes was telling her. The emergency preparedness exercise would likely include activities that could expose her true capabilities, forcing her to either demonstrate skills that contradicted her librarian persona or perform poorly enough to maintain her cover while failing to contribute meaningfully to community safety preparations. "I see," Emma said quietly, her mind already working through the implications and potential complications. "And I assume participation in this exercise won't be optional for community members with relevant experience or skills." The county strongly encourages participation from anyone with military or law enforcement background, Hayes confirmed. It's considered a civic responsibility, a way for experienced community members to contribute to regional preparedness and public safety initiatives. Emma nodded, understanding that she was being presented with an impossible choice. Participate in the exercise and risk exposing capabilities that would generate exactly the kind of official attention she'd been trying to avoid. Or decline to participate and risk appearing unpatriotic or unwilling to contribute to community safety in ways that her supposed military background should make natural. "When is this exercise scheduled?" Emma asked, though she already suspected the answer would give her less time to prepare than she would have preferred. 3 weeks from Saturday," Hayes replied. "Registration is due by Friday, so you'll need to decide fairly quickly whether you want to participate or if you have scheduling conflicts that would prevent your involvement." Emma felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life closing in around her, but she maintained her composure because revealing her anxiety would only confirm Hayes' suspicions about her background and current situation. "I'll need to check my calendar and see what commitments I have that weekend, but I appreciate the information and the opportunity to contribute if my schedule allows." Hayes studied her face one more time, his expression suggesting he was cataloging her responses and micro-expressions for future reference. "Emma, whatever you decide about the exercise, whatever questions arise about your background or your capabilities, remember that Cedar Falls is your home now and we look out for our own. Don't let the past prevent you from accepting the support and friendship that people here want to offer you." Emma felt emotion rise in her throat again because Hayes' words touched on her deepest longing, to be accepted and valued as part of a community without having to constantly manage the gap between who she appeared to be and who she really was. "Thank you, Captain Hayes. That means more to me than you'll ever know." As Hayes walked away toward his vehicle, Emma stood alone in the parking area, watching the last light fade from the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls, feeling the weight of decisions and revelations pressing down on her like a physical force. The peaceful life she'd built in this remote Montana town suddenly felt fragile and temporary, threatened by forces beyond her control and complicated by loyalties that pulled her in directions she hadn't expected to navigate. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and changing leaves, reminders that seasons turned regardless of human plans, and that change was as inevitable as the mountain winters that would soon blanket Cedar Falls in snow. Emma pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and headed back toward the community center, where Jake was probably wondering what had happened to her, and where there were still chairs to fold and tables to store, and the ordinary responsibilities of community life to fulfill. But as she walked back toward the warm lights and familiar voices of the Autumn Harvest Festival, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in the space of a single conversation, that the careful balance she'd maintained between her past and present was about to be tested in ways she wasn't prepared to handle, and that the peaceful anonymity she'd treasured for 7 years was about to be replaced by exactly the kind of attention and scrutiny she'd moved to Cedar Falls to avoid. Emma woke before dawn on Monday morning with the kind of restless energy that came from a night spent processing conversations that changed everything, while pretending nothing had changed at all. The library wouldn't open for another 3 hours, but she found herself standing in her kitchen making coffee with mechanical precision, while her mind worked through the implications of Captain Hayes' warning about federal inquiries and emergency preparedness exercises that could expose capabilities she'd spent 7 years keeping hidden. Her small apartment above Peterson's hardware store had become a sanctuary over the years, furnished with second-hand pieces that prioritized comfort over style, and books that reflected her genuine interests rather than the carefully curated collection she maintained at the library for public consumption. The morning light filtering through her east-facing windows revealed a space that was orderly without being sterile, lived in without being cluttered, the kind of home that suggested someone who valued peace and privacy above social impression. Emma carried her coffee to the window overlooking Main Street, watching Cedar Falls emerge from sleep with the gradual rhythm of a town that had never learned to hurry. Miller's coffee shop showed the first signs of life as proprietor Helen Miller arrived to begin the daily ritual of transforming beans and water into the fuel that powered community conversations. Across the street, the community center sat quiet in the early morning light, no trace remaining of yesterday's festival except for a few stray pieces of tape on the windows where signs had been posted. The normalcy of the scene felt both comforting and fragile, as if the peaceful routine of small-town life existed in a bubble that could be burst by forces Emma couldn't control or predict. She'd chosen Cedar Falls specifically because it felt removed from the kinds of attention and scrutiny that came with urban environments. Because the geographic isolation of rural Montana created natural barriers between her present life and the classified world she'd left behind. Now Captain Hayes's words echoed in her memory, reminding her that distance and time weren't always sufficient protection from pasts that refused to stay buried. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake, sent with the enthusiasm of someone young enough to believe that early morning energy was universally appreciated. Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for letting me help with the festival yesterday. It was amazing how you made everything run so smoothly. Can I ask you about event planning techniques sometime? I'm thinking about changing my major to public administration. Emma smiled despite her anxiety because Jake's message reminded her of why she'd come to value her life in Cedar Falls. The genuine connection she'd formed with community members, the opportunity to contribute to something positive and constructive, the satisfaction of using her organizational skills to create experiences that brought families together rather than achieving objectives that remained classified long after missions ended. These relationships represented the best part of her new identity, the aspects of her current life that made the constant vigilance and careful self-monitoring worthwhile. She typed back a brief response encouraging Jake's interest in public service, while deflecting his request for a more detailed conversation about her planning methods. Emma had learned to be generous with encouragement and stingy with information, supporting people's growth and aspirations while avoiding discussions that might reveal the specialized training behind her apparently intuitive competencies. The library opened at 9, and Emma arrived at 8:30 as she always did, using the quiet hour before patrons arrived to process returned books, update displays, and prepare for the day's activities with the methodical approach she applied to all responsibilities. The Cedar Falls Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its rooms retaining the intimate proportions of domestic space, while serving the public functions of information access and community gathering. Emma had fallen in love with the building during her job interview 7 years ago, recognizing in its combination of historic character and practical adaptation something that mirrored her own journey from one kind of life to another. The library's morning routine had become a meditation for her, a sequence of familiar tasks that grounded her in the present moment while providing structure for days that might otherwise feel directionless or undefined. She was processing the weekend's returned books when she noticed an unfamiliar volume that hadn't come from the library's collection. A technical manual on advanced ballistics and long-range precision shooting, the kind of specialized publication that wasn't available through normal civilian channels, and definitely wasn't part of Cedar Falls Public Library's recreational reading collection. The book had been returned with the weekend's materials, suggesting someone had deliberately placed it where Emma would find it, but the cover bore no identifying marks or checkout information that would indicate who had left it or why. Emma felt her pulse quicken as she examined the manual more closely, recognizing immediately that it contained information far beyond civilian hunting or recreational shooting applications. The mathematical formulas and environmental calculation tables were familiar from her military training, representing knowledge that had been classified at the time she'd learned it and wasn't typically available in public forums. Someone had left this book specifically for her to find, and that someone possessed both knowledge of her background and access to materials that suggested official connections. The library's front door chimed as the first patron of the day arrived, forcing Emma to set aside the ballistics manual and shift her attention to public service responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who visited the library 3 times a week to maintain her connection to educational resources and community activities, approached the circulation desk with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she had specific research goals, rather than casual browsing intentions. "Good morning, Emma dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd spent decades making children feel welcome in learning environments. "I'm hoping you can help me find some information about emergency preparedness. All this talk about the county exercise has me thinking I should update my family's disaster planning, make sure we're ready for whatever winter might bring." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature, because Mrs. Patterson's request suggested that news of the emergency preparedness exercise was already circulating through the community, creating exactly the kind of attention and discussion that would make Emma's participation or non-participation more visible and significant. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson. What specific aspects of emergency preparedness are you most interested in? Food storage, communication plans, medical supplies?" "Oh, a little bit of everything, I suppose," Mrs. Patterson replied, settling into the chair beside the circulation desk with the comfortable authority of someone who considered the library an extension of her own living room. "But I'm particularly curious about the kinds of skills they'll be testing in this county exercise. Richard Hayes mentioned that they're looking for people with military experience to participate in marksmanship evaluations and tactical assessments. It makes me realize how little I know about those kinds of capabilities." Emma chose her words carefully, understanding that her response would likely be repeated throughout the community, with the efficiency that characterized small-town information networks. "Emergency preparedness covers a wide range of skills, Mrs. Patterson. Most of them are quite practical and accessible to civilian learning: basic first aid, radio communication, resource management during disruptions of normal services." "But surely there are more specialized skills involved," Mrs. Patterson pressed, her curiosity clearly piqued by the hint of mystery surrounding the county exercise. "Skills that require professional training or military experience. I imagine someone with your background would be quite valuable in that kind of exercise." Emma felt the familiar anxiety that came whenever community members made assumptions about her military service, or suggested that her background qualified her for activities that would require demonstrating capabilities she preferred to keep private. "Military service takes many forms, Mrs. Patterson. Most veterans develop skills that translate well to civilian emergency preparedness, but those skills aren't necessarily dramatic or specialized." Mrs. Patterson studied Emma's face with the practiced attention of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of student responses and parent conferences. "Emma, dear, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you have a way of deflecting questions about your military service that makes me think your experience might have involved more than standard assignments. There's something about the way you organize events, solve problems, handle crisis situations that suggests training beyond what most people receive." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks because Mrs. Patterson's observation cut uncomfortably close to truths she'd spent years concealing. "Some people adapt more quickly to civilian leadership roles than others, Mrs. Patterson. It's not necessarily an indication of specialized training, just different approaches to problem-solving and organization." "Perhaps," Mrs. Patterson said, but her tone suggested polite skepticism rather than acceptance. "Although I did notice yesterday at the festival that your face painting demonstrated the kind of precision and steady hands that reminded me of my late husband's surgical work. He used to say that certain kinds of training left permanent marks on how people approached detailed tasks, even when those tasks were completely unrelated to their professional background." Emma felt the walls of her carefully constructed cover story beginning to crack under the gentle but persistent pressure of Mrs. Patterson's attention. The observation about precision and steady hands was particularly unsettling, because it suggested that Emma's attempts to blend into civilian life weren't as successful as she'd believed, that her specialized training revealed itself in ways she hadn't anticipated or learned to control. "She mattered," Rachel screamed, all her corporate composure finally cracking. "She was my child, and she mattered more than any of this." She gestured around the opulent study, at the evidence of wealth that had been purchased with her daughter's life. Robert's face hardened into the expression that had terrified her as a child. "Don't be naive, Rachel. Love doesn't pay bills or build empires. That baby would have been an anchor around your neck, pulling you down into mediocrity." "Sophia is alive," Rachel said quietly, watching her father's reaction carefully. "Your plan failed. Someone saved her, and she's been living 20 minutes from here for 7 years. For the first time, Robert Martinez looked genuinely shaken. His whiskey glass trembled in his hand before he set it down with deliberate care. "That's impossible. The death certificate was filed. The cremation was handled. The cremation of an empty coffin, Rachel clarified. While you were arranging paperwork, a nurse was saving my daughter's life. Sophia has been living as Lily Thompson, raised by a man who's given her more love and attention than you ever gave me. Robert sank into his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. If this is true, then you have a problem. Legally, that man has been her father for 7 years. He has adoption papers, custody agreements. You have no claim to her. I have DNA, Rachel said coldly. I have hospital records, witness testimony, and evidence of fraud. But more than that, I have something you never understood. I have love that doesn't depend on conditions or achievements. What do you want from me? Robert asked, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. I want you to stay away from her. Away from both of them. And I want you to understand that you're not her grandfather. You gave up that right when you tried to kill her. Rachel left her father's house feeling simultaneously vindicated and hollow. 7 years of grief had been validated, but the knowledge couldn't restore the years she'd lost or erase the damage that had been done. The hardest conversation still lay ahead. She found David at the apartment complex that evening, helping Lily with homework at a small table in their living room. Through the window, Rachel could see them bent over math problems, David's patient voice explaining concepts while Lily chewed on her pencil with the intense concentration of someone determined to understand. When Rachel knocked, David answered with surprise that quickly shifted to concern. He was still in his work clothes, grease on his hands from some mechanical task, but his attention was immediately focused on her obvious distress. Rachel, is everything okay? I need to talk to you, she said, glancing toward Lily, who had looked up from her homework with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. It's important. David must have heard something in her tone because he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. They walked to a small courtyard where children's voices provided background noise for the conversation that would change everything. 7 years ago, Rachel began, her hands shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. I gave birth to a daughter at Phoenix General Hospital. I was told she died from cardiac complications when she was 6 hours old. David listened quietly, his expression growing more concerned as Rachel continued. She didn't die, Rachel said, pulling out the photograph Margaret had given her. She was saved by your sister Jessica during a power outage. Jessica took her and created the fiction of an abandoned baby to protect her from people who wanted her gone. David stared at the photograph, and Rachel watched understanding dawn across his features like sunrise over desert mountains. The baby in the picture looked exactly like Lily had at that age, down to the distinctive birthmark and the serious expression that suggested an old soul in a tiny body. You're saying that Lily is your biological daughter, David said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. I'm saying that Sophia Martinez became Lily Thompson the night your sister saved her life, Rachel confirmed. The bracelet that had to be cut off her wrist when she was 1? I put it there during the few hours I thought I had with her before she died. David sank onto a concrete bench, the photograph trembling in his hands. Jessica never told me any of this. She said Lily was abandoned, that someone had left her with just a note asking people to love her. Jessica was protecting all of you, Rachel said gently. She knew that powerful people had wanted Sophia gone, and she probably thought keeping the secret would keep Lily safe. Powerful people, David repeated, looking up at Rachel with new understanding. Your father. Rachel nodded, explaining about Robert Martinez's intervention, about the falsified death certificate and the conspiracy that had stolen 7 years of her daughter's life. David listened with the focused attention of someone processing information that redefined everything he thought he knew about his world. What does this mean? David asked finally. What are you going to do? Rachel had been dreading this question because she honestly didn't know the answer. Legally, I could probably fight for custody. I have DNA evidence, witness testimony, proof of fraud. But David, you've been her father for 7 years. You've loved her, raised her, sacrificed everything for her. I can't just take her away from that. But she's your daughter, David said quietly. You lost 7 years with her because of something you had no control over. Don't you want those years back? I want what's best for Lily, Rachel replied. And what's best for her is having both of us in her life. You've given her stability, love, a foundation of security that money can't buy. I can give her opportunities, education, a future without financial stress. But together, we could give her everything. David was quiet for a long moment, watching children play in the courtyard while processing the impossible situation they found themselves in. Are you talking about some kind of custody arrangement? I'm talking about becoming a family, Rachel said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Not traditional, maybe, but real. Lily loves you, David. That's not going to change because we've discovered the truth about her origins, and I care about both of you more than I expected to. You care about us, David repeated, and Rachel heard something in his voice that might have been hope. I've spent 7 years believing my daughter was dead, Rachel said. I built an empire on grief and rage, thinking that success could somehow fill the hole she left behind. But meeting you, seeing how you've raised her, watching the way you love her without conditions or expectations, it's shown me what I've been missing. David stood and walked a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, shoulders tense with the weight of decisions that would affect all their futures. What about the practical things? She's used to living here, going to the neighborhood school, having Mrs. Chen babysit. She's never known wealth or privilege. Then we don't change what's working, Rachel said simply. I can move closer, be part of her daily routine instead of disrupting it. I can help with expenses without making you feel like charity. I can be her mother without trying to replace you as her father. And us? David asked, turning to face her. What happens between us in all this? Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past week, her feelings for David had grown from gratitude to genuine affection to something deeper that she was afraid to name. He was everything she'd forgotten men could be: honest, gentle, strong without needing to prove it, devoted to something more important than himself. I'd like to find out, she admitted. I know this is complicated, and I know we're from different worlds. But David, you've shown me what real love looks like. Not love that depends on success or achievement, but love that just is. I'd like to learn how to be that kind of person. Before David could respond, the apartment door opened and Lily emerged, looking for her father with the impatience of a 7-year-old who'd been left alone too long. But when she saw Rachel, her expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. I thought you might be my real mom, Lily said with the directness that only children possessed. I kept dreaming about a lady who looked like you, who smelled like you, who cried about losing me. And when I saw you at the gas station, it felt like coming home. Rachel knelt down to Lily's level, tears streaming down her face. How did you know? I don't know, Lily replied, reaching out to touch Rachel's cheek with the gentle curiosity of someone confirming a long-held suspicion. I just felt it, like when you know it's going to rain, even though the sky is still blue. Are you upset? Rachel asked, afraid of the answer. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. I'm happy, she said finally, because now I have a daddy and a mama, and we can all be together, like a real family. It might be complicated, David warned gently. Adults have to figure out legal things, and there might be difficult conversations ahead. Adults always make things complicated, Lily said with the wisdom of someone who'd observed grown-ups for 7 years. But love isn't complicated. Love just is. 6 months later, Rachel sat in the backyard of the house she'd bought in David's neighborhood, watching her daughter teach her new baby brother how to stack blocks, while David grilled dinner on a barbecue that had come with the house. It wasn't the mansion she could have afforded, but it was home in a way her penthouse had never been. The legal battles had been resolved with surprising ease once Robert Martinez had decided not to fight the revelations about Sophia's survival. Perhaps guilt had finally caught up with him, or perhaps he'd realized that fighting would only bring more attention to his role in the conspiracy. Either way, he'd quietly removed himself from their lives, leaving Rachel free to build the family she'd always wanted. The wedding had been small, held in the same courtyard where Rachel had confessed the truth about Lily's origins. Elena had served as maid of honor, Mrs. Chen had provided flowers from her garden, and Lily had walked down the makeshift aisle carrying rings and wearing a dress that perfectly matched her light-up shoes. I have something for you, Rachel said to Lily as the little girl abandoned her blocks in favor of climbing into Rachel's lap. She pulled out a small jewelry box containing a delicate bracelet, sized perfectly for a 7-year-old wrist. "It's beautiful," Lily breathed, holding up her arm so Rachel could fasten the clasp. "What does it say?" "Sophia," Rachel replied, watching her daughter trace the engraved letters with careful fingers. "It's your first name. Your real name. The name I gave you when you were born." "Sophia Lily Thompson Martinez," Lily said, testing how it sounded. "That's a lot of names for one person." "That's because you have a lot of people who love you," David said, joining them on the porch swing with the baby gurgling contentedly in his arms. "Each name represents someone who chose you, someone who fought for you, someone who couldn't imagine life without you." Rachel leaned against David's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had anchored both her and Lily through the storms of discovery and change. Their love story hadn't been conventional, but it had been real in ways that surprised her with their depth. "Tell me the star story again," Lily requested, settling more comfortably in Rachel's lap while David adjusted the baby's blanket. "Once upon a time," Rachel began, the ritual they'd established over months of bedtime stories and quiet evenings, "there was a little star that got lost in the darkness. She wandered for years, looking for where she belonged, until one night she saw the lights of home and followed them back to the people who'd been wishing for her return. And they all lived happily ever after," Lily finished with satisfaction. "They all lived together," Rachel corrected gently, "which is better than happily ever after, because it's real." As the Arizona sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rachel Martinez Thompson watched her husband teach their son to wave while their daughter drew pictures of their family with chalk on the sidewalk. The life she'd built wasn't the one she'd planned, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes the best gifts came disguised as strangers at gas stations, she thought, remembering that night when David had spent his last $20 helping someone he didn't know. His kindness had led her home to the daughter she'd thought was lost forever, to the love she'd never believed she deserved, to the understanding that family wasn't just about blood or DNA, but about the choice to show up for each other, day after day, in all the small moments that added up to a life worth living. The little girl who'd once been abandoned to die had grown up surrounded by love in all its forms, proof that sometimes the universe conspires to heal what seems permanently broken, and that the strongest families are often the ones that choose each other against all odds and refuse to let go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.